Here we are at Jim Kelly's house. We have another interview with Master of Science Fiction. Yeah, it's you. Okay. Again, I prepared some questions, and I'm going to ask to Jim. You were considered the human side of cyberpunk movement. How did you cope with the low-life, high-tech paradigm promoted by writers like Gibson and Sterling?
Well, so I went to Clarion in 1974, and one of my Clarion mates was Bruce Sterling. And so I had been following, as is the case when you go come into a field with a group of people, your cohort, you follow how they are doing. And so I certainly was watching what Bruce was doing. And I have to say that one of the things about the cyberpunks of the time was that, like myself, they were sort of aggressively middle class. They weren't really low lives at all. Bill Gibson and Bruce Sterling and Lou Shiner and Pat Cadigan, I mean, they weren't upper class, but they certainly weren't, street punks. And so when the cyberpunk ethos sort of started glorifying this, I thought, well, okay, I can play in that game too, but I'm just playing it, and I'm not really living the life any more than the rest of them were. But I found that very interesting. In some ways, I didn't really care that much about the low-life parts of it. I mean, I guess the first real cyberpunky story I wrote was a story called Solstice, and it was about a well-to-do drug designer. Now, I was much more interested in the hallucinogenic and mind-altering aspects of cyberpunk than some of the other hacking. At that point, certainly I was more interested in the playing with the chemicals in your mind rather than the digits in the cyberspace.
Oh,
But these things were all things that we were imagining in the same way we'd imagine what it looked like what it would be like to live in space, or what it would like to be living in, the Middle Ages. This was not something that we had direct experience of, and so, insofar as I was able to capture any of these low life or alternative culture kinds of experiences, I probably was no more advantaged nor disadvantaged than some other people. Although I have to say, Bruce, for instance, had a more. I know that Bruce lived abroad and had some more, global experiences than many of us did. But Bill Gibson moved to Canada. So anyway. Maybe he'd been to Japan. I don't know. I mean, we don't know where all these people were. But nonetheless, I'm saying that part of the job of being a science fiction writer or a writer of anything is to cast yourself into odd situations and see how you would react.
Golden Age science fiction is gone. 70s wave is the past, and cyberpunk is dead.
Oh, no, it isn't.
Still, science fiction is alive.
Yeah.
Could it be that fishing ideas out of the future makes the science fiction genre, as a matter of fact, kind of immortal?
Well, I'm wondering about that. I mean, I think this is an interesting question. I mean, one of the projects I've always tried to wrap my mind around, I've never got around to writing it, although I have touched on it a little bit, is what would science fiction be about in the future? What would science fiction be about? What will science fiction be about in 2050, 2101? At that point, lots of the things, the near future technology that we've talked about, maybe mind uploading or the singularity will have happened. Well, what would science fiction be like post-singularity? So I would argue that if you believe in the singularity, for instance, it's not necessarily immortal, because science fiction, to some extent, is the investigation of possibilities that we can imagine. And so if the possibilities that we can imagine, if we can't imagine the future, as some people in the singularity would argue, who believe in the singularity would argue, then science fiction's got problems. But even insofar as, one of the staples of science fiction is we're going to the planets and maybe the stars. Well, it may be. As a matter of fact, the science tells us that our likelihood of going to the stars is very small. We may well get out into the solar system, but the solar system, space itself, is fraught with dangers for us. We're not designed to withstand the radiation, the weightlessness, the actual claustrophobic imprisonment of getting in a spaceship and going 2 years or whatever to a year to Mars or 3 years to the asteroid belt. Given as fast as we can go, that's a lot of time to be spent up in a tin can. So if science fiction is about the future of our future in space, and we come to the point where we're pretty sure that our future in space is pretty limited, if we have one at all, then what's science fiction about? I don't necessarily buy the idea that it's immortal. I guess basically what I'm saying is that the science fiction of the future will probably be about stuff that we can't really predict at this moment. Oh, and here's our cat.
Come on.
This is our science fiction cat, off screen.
Come.
No,
okay.
Off she goes.
Okay.
Your chance at stardom, cat. You've lost it.
At a certain point of their lives, any science fiction writer is a science fiction reader.
Yeah.
What book made you believe that you could write as good as, or even better than that?
This is the classic thing. You're reading along and you're saying, I could write that story. They published that story? I can write better than that. Now, that would be unfair for me to actually name a story, but once upon a time, I hit upon this project when I was still a pretty young writer, that I would review a complete issue of a magazine. This is before the review zine started, somewhat before the internet. I would review a complete issue of F&SF and Analog and Asimov's, and as if I was workshopping it. So I would say, okay, if this is science fiction, and we know that in every year there are some wonderful stories published in a magazine, but what about the ordinary stories? What can we say about them? And it occurs to me that different magazines have good months and bad months, but the average of science fiction magazine is not particularly wonderful. It conveys the sense of the future, or the sense of exploration that a reader would want, but it isn't as memorable. In other words, if you read a year's worth of Asimov's or a year's worth of Clarkesworld, you're not going to remember more than a handful of stories. But you read all those stories, so what was it that you got out of the stories that you read, but you didn't particularly care for? And that's an interesting question, because I've written 120 or something on stories, and I'm sure there's lots of readers out there who would say that, okay, if I'm lucky, he's written 5 or 7 or 10 stories that I really remember, and that means 110 stories that, I could barely remember them. And so I think that this is one of the things that it's not a problem, but it is a fact that we all have to come to grips with. And of course, Theodore Sturgeon's law said it best. Somebody asked him, how can you read that? How can you read that crap? How can you write that crap that is science fiction? And he said, well, there's some good stuff. As a matter of fact, 90% of everything is crap. And so if there's only 10% that's really good, that's really memorable, what does that mean? It means that people are trying, and with every story is an experiment, and some experiments succeed wonderfully, and some not so much.
Long live the crap.
Yeah, but you can't the crap is necessary. The pile of not to extend this metaphor, the pile of crap is necessary. The 90% of crap is necessary so that you have the jewels at the top, the 10%.
Yeah. Creative writing courses versus workshops. Would you suggest to get involved to improve one's skills and awareness or to meet with other writers? What's their most important usefulness?
Well, I should say that almost everything you've read of mine has been workshopped. I'm a total devotee of the workshop. I think it's invaluable. So what does it do for me? Well, when I started out, it was helping me master my craft, and it helped me do this sort of practice that you need in order to, and you need to spend a lot of time when you start out learning how to do all the things that you need to do. And I tell this to my students sometimes, it could be as long as 8 or 10 years from the time you start working very hard and practicing as hard as you can to the time you actually get to where you want to be. And so this was the case for me. It's been the case for many of my friends, and I've actually done some research on this, which isn't to say that you won't at some point publish, even though you have not yet mastered your craft. And so I have maybe 8 or 10 or 12 stories that I've written at the start of my career, which I was very happy to sell, which I was very pleased with at the time, which I do not think are particularly worth your time. They're part of that, to go back to our metaphor, they're part of that 90%. And maybe they're even at the bottom of that 90%. They're the sludge level. But nonetheless, they got published. And so, so what is it that workshops do? It provides the feedback you need to sort of improve your work, to understand what fraction, and you only get usually a fraction of the wonderful idea that you have in your head onto the page, but what fraction of that idea you've gotten onto the page that readers can understand. And so that's what's helpful. But the other thing about it is that it supports, I mean, you've sort of hinted at your question. It's, if you're in a regular workshop, and we were just in a workshop last night, yes. And so we did a story by Francesco and a story by me and a story by Sarah Smith, who's in our workshop. So this was 3 hours of intense discussion of what worked in the story, what I or Francesco might want to change if we wanted to go on and rewrite. And so then, though, at the end of the workshop, so now we sit and you say, okay, now, we're going to have a next workshop probably in May. Who will have something for May? And that is an important thing, because especially if you're still trying to build a professional working method, when somebody says to you, you need to have a story for May or you're not in this workshop anymore, or, well, whatever. But, there is that peer pressure, which is at once a kind of not a punishment, but it's a friendly reminder that we're all doing writing here, a friendly reminder that we all have to be professional here, and a friendly reminder that if you're not a professional, if you're not turning stories in, then you're not a professional. So there's that sort of natural, this sort of natural deadline that happens that freelance writers don't usually have. Yeah, I mean, if you're working at a job and the boss says, I need the whatchamacallit report by Friday, Friday's the deadline. But when you're a science fiction writer or a writer of any kind and you're freelancing and there's no boss saying the deadline is Friday, it's when you get your act together to do the work. So this is this extra part of workshopping is, I found, very invaluable.
It's like a stick and carrot strategy.
That's correct. It's the stick is the stick and the carrot is in there. The stick is that if you don't show up and put something in, we're going to be mad at you. The carrot is that we'll talk about your stuff and help you, and the stick again is, but we'll tell you what's wrong with it, so you have to work like another 2 weeks in order to fix it. But
Right. You've met writers such as Asimov, Alan Ellison, and Frederick Brown. Do you have any anecdote to tell?
Okay. This is always dangerous. Wait, is this going to be on the internet? Oh my gosh!
I will tell something hot. We want something.
I will tell a story which I have told before. So, when I was a fairly young writer, I was not particularly good. In science fiction conventions in the United States, there are you go to a science fiction convention, and one of the ways that readers can meet their writer idols, or at least the writers that they want to meet, is these writers will get up on a panel and talk about different things. The future of religion, or science fiction in space, or, science fiction versus fantasy. So there'll be an array of writers up there behind a desk, and the audience sitting in the hall waiting to hear words of wisdom drop from their mouths. And so when I was a fairly new writer, I would volunteer to be on these panels because I thought this was a good way to get exposure. But on the other hand, I was so nervous. I had published like hardly anything. I didn't have the self-confidence to do it. And so I would sort of like get way at the end of the panel and, on one side and hide from the moderator and like, don't ask me any questions. I just want to be here. So in this shy moment of my career, I show up for a panel and I sit at the very end, and sitting next to me is Robert Silverberg. Robert Silverberg was a model for my career. When John Kessler and I, my good friend John Kessler and I used to say, if we were going to have a career, we'd like to have Robert Silverberg's career. It's a career that shows literary ambition. It's a career that he's a prolific writer. He's written nonfiction. He's written fiction. He's got a ton of awards. And he also is very smooth and intellectual and urbane, and he's just a person you could sit and listen to for hours. And plus I had read not all, but I had been a huge fan of Robert Silverberg's work. And so, as happens, I'm sitting there at the panel, and the panel is not yet started, and he sits down next to me, and I'm sitting next to Robert Silverberg. I can't believe it. And 5 years ago, I was just a nobody, and now I'm sitting next to him. So I turned to him in my best, suave manner and say, Mr. Silverberg, I do the fanboy thing, but I'm trying to be cool about it. Mr. Silverberg, I am one of your biggest fans. Just the wrong thing. You cannot say that to a writer. There's nothing a writer can say. And so he looks at me and says, what writers do say, which is, oh, that's very nice, or something not inconsequential. So then I realized he's noticed me. I'm on his radar. He realized I'm sitting next to him, so I had to say something else. So I say, Mr. Silverberg, I have to tell you something. This is the first book, when I was like 12 years old, the first book I ever bought with my own allowance was your book, The Man in the Maze. And he looked at me and he said, Jim, I will thank you never to speak of this again. And I said, what? What did I do? And I realized that I'm a man of 35 or so, and he doesn't want to hear that 12 years ago, when I was 12, I bought, it's sort of saying, well, old fella, it's funny you can still get up on the panel here, stagger up here. And so I felt so embarrassed. But then I said, so now I thought I totally stuck my, here it is, my foot is in my mouth, and so I said to him though, and so at the time, I just didn't understand that book. I mean, I loved it, but I didn't understand what was going on, because obviously Robert Silverberg knew all about the Mythophilactetes. But when I pointed out that I had not only read this story when I was 12, but thought about it a lot, and then reread it when I was, then he was impressed. And so I would like to say that, Bob, I keep telling this story. I'm sorry, but if you're listening to this, it's one of my favorite stories, because it actually, subsequently, Mr. Silverberg and I have become good friends, and he's bought stories from me, and we go out to dinner from time to time, and so it's sort of like one of those, of all the golden age, of all the great writers, let's not call them golden age, but all the great writers, he's the one actually I think I've gotten the closest to, of all my idols. He's the one I've actually become, close with.
Okay, last question. can you tell us something about your next novel?
I can. So I'm I'm sitting here giving this interview, and I should be writing this novel. I don't know what I'm doing. I am at work on a novel of which parts of which I've already published. So and it doesn't have a name yet, but the parts I've already published are a short story called Going Deep, which was an Asimov several years ago. Another short story called Plus or Minus, which was in Asimov's a couple of years subsequent to that first story, and a story called Tourists, which was in Jonathan Strahan's Eclipse. So that's about 40,000 words of a novel, and these pieces were always designed to go together, and they start more or less immediately after the beginning of one is immediately after the end of the previous one. So, and so now I am about I would say 20,000 words into the one last piece, which will bring that story sequence to its conclusion. And so it's a story about our exploration of the solar system. We have I don't exactly believe in interstellar travel, but then I don't believe in ghosts. I write about that. You make something up. So I have a wormhole which will help us get to the stars. And my good idea, I think the thing I'm most proud of at this point is that the wormhole goes not to stars in to an area of our own galaxy. It goes to a distant, very distant, I think it's like 150,000 light years away. But it's a galaxy that we've discovered that is hyperdense, so that 80% of all the star mass is within 80 light years. The theory is that it collided with another galaxy, and so the exterior stars were sort of sloughed off, and all that's left is the dense core. So in order to go from place to place in this star system, in this galaxy, the distances aren't as far, and so the wormhole takes people out there, and so we basically come to realize that unless we use that wormhole, we're never going to get to another star. It's just too hard to do. But so we've explored and exploited the solar system, and the question is, will we build a starship to go to explore this other galaxy? And the problem is, and this is a thing that science fiction writers never do very well, is think about the economics of building a starship that's going to found a colony that's going to go to another galaxy in order to create that antimatter that will power this starship to get to the wormhole is like the gross economy of half the countries in the world. And so for a world economy to expel a starship, or to basically to load a starship with all this monetary value and then send it off, it's like asking for a depression. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, we want to go out and boldly go where no man has gone before, but not if it's going to cost us everything we've got. And so they build this starship, nonetheless, and then they start realizing how expensive it is, and so they're going to cancel the starship program. And so our heroine, who grew up in space, who is destined to be a spacer, she's the clone of a doctor who is on a starship's crew. She and her comrades, when they cancel the starship program, are going to. And so that's the book that I'm working on.
Into Cyberpunk. Oh, Cyberpunk. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, so that's the book I'm working on, and I hope to have it done by the summer.
Wow, that's short.
I'm very close.
Good luck. Hope to do it soon then.
Yeah, let's finish this interview so I can finish writing it.
Yes, there you go. Go back to work then. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.